Grand opening. Beitza shenolda b'yontif. And a lot of what we're going to study today is about muktzah, nolad, and what's called hachana d'Rabba. Those are some of the key subjects of this daf, the beginning of the Masechet, but there are other secondary, tributary aspects to what we're going to learn today. The Mishnah opens with a machlokes between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. And the machlokes is about a Beitza shenolda b'yontif, but once the Gemara quotes this machlokes about Beitza shenolda b'yontif, the Gemara broadens its discussion about other aspects of yontif, about which we have a controversy between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. So as far as Beitza shenolda b'yontif, the chicken laid an egg on yontif, and now there's a twofold question. Question number one is, are you allowed to eat that egg on yontif that the hen laid on yontif? And secondly, are you allowed to move it, which is called tilted? So Beit Shammai omer te'ochet, that you're allowed to eat it on yontif. Beit Shammai did not mention anything about tiltul, about moving the egg, but usually we apply the following logic. If you're allowed to eat it, then certainly, how much more so, you're allowed to move it. Beis Hillel omer lo te'ochet. Now, in the case of Beis Hillel, they tell you you're not allowed to eat that egg until after Yontif, but they don't say whether it's also the tiltul on you. That far, I don't know if Beis Hillel went. It's not clear from the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to analyze this machlokes, and one of the issues that we're going to discuss is that here it turns out Beit Shammai is the mekil, whereas Beis Hillel are the machmirim. That is a very rare exception to the rule, because as a general rule, Beit Shammai are the machmirim and Beis Hillel the mekil. But this seems to be an exception to the rule. But that is going to come under investigation later on in the sugya. Beit Shammai omrim sior b'kizayis, chametz b'koseves, Beis Hillel omrim zeh b'kizayis. We're talking now about the shear of chametz for the Iser chametz. Now the Iser chametz divides up to two subcategories: the Iser achila of chametz, and then there's an Iser called bal yirah, bal yipotzei. You're not allowed to maintain possession over chametz during the Pesach holiday. And the Gemara is going to analyze in what context do we have the discussion about Mishnah about the minimum shear of chametz, less than which the Torah doesn't prohibit it. And we're going to work with the assumption now that the discussion here is about ownership over chametz, which is called bal yirah, bal yipotzei. Beit Shammai omrim sior is kizayis. Now, what is sior? Sior is a piece of bread, let's say a loaf of bread. If you leave it for a long period of time, then it's called hechmitza ma'od, meaning it got very, very fermented to the point to which it's so sour that you can't eat it. It's not edible anymore. But it serves as a leavening agent. If you add it to a mixture of flour and water, it will speed up the process of fermentation. It's kind of like yeast in that sense. It's
sourdough.
Yeah, but
you take a piece of it, put it in a new dough.
And new dough, and then it causes fermentation. Now, if you'll notice, there doesn't seem to be any machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about the shear of sior. However, there is a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about the shear of chametz. And that means, what is the minimum amount of chametz for which you violate the ownership of chametz over Pesach? And once again, we have a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beis Hillel are mekil because they talk about a larger size, which is called a koseves, otherwise known as a date, a tamra in Hebrew. And a tamra is pretty much the size of a beitza. It's probably about, let's say, 2 fluid ounces, maybe even 3 fluid ounces. And that's a great kula because Beis Hillel say that you're going to violate Bal Yirah B'Motzi for owning chametz, even if it's the smallest amount of a kizayis. Now we have a third machlok between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, and this has to do with what's called kisui hadam on yontif. What that means is that if you shecht either an oaf, a bird, or a chaya, again, shechting a chaya is quite rare. I don't know if you've ever eaten venison meat, but that would be a deer, which is a chaya. In any event, the Torah obligates us in the mitzvah of Kisei Adam. And that comes under a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Zayin, the ish asher yotzu tzayid chaya o of asher ye'achel v'shufachas damo. After the shechita, the dam is available on the floor. V'kiso b'yafar. The Torah says that you're obligated in the mitzvah of Kisei Adam. This mitzvah does not apply to a behemoth. It only applies to chayav v'yof. Now, shechita on yontif is permissible. It's a malacha v'ochel nefesh. So Beit Shammai omrim, anything that's necessary in the context of shechita, and in this particular specific context, we're talking about Kisei Adam, is mutter on yontif. That is the broader definition of ochel nefesh. Therefore, yachpar b'deker, he could take a shovel, dig into the ground, v'yachasa es hadam, and he could cover the dam. Now, digging into the ground, which is called chafira, is a tolda of meleches charisha, of plowing. And yet, Beit Shammai allows it on yontif. Now, we don't do malach on yontif unless it's ochel nefesh. And Beit Shammai says that since we would not shech the animal unless we did kisei adam, therefore, you get a package deal. You're allowed to not only shech the animal, but also you're allowed to cover its dam. Beis Hillel omrim lo yishchot. I'd rather tell you, instead of violating a malacha for the sake of kisei adam, I'd rather tell you don't shecht at all. Elim kein haylo offer muchan mibod yom. If he had prepared what he needed for kisei adam, and therefore he didn't need to do a malacha of chafira on yontif, that's fine. He's got the offer, and he'll cover the dam. But if he didn't prepare that beforehand, then he should not shech the animal, because if he shechs the animal, he's chayiv in kisei adam, and he'll have to violate yontif, and that we don't want to allow. But modim, but Beis Hillel concede, Jim Shachar, if he went ahead to the evidence and he shechted the bird, sheyachpar b'deker v'yachasa, that he's allowed to dig into the ground in order to cover the dam. And why is that allowed? Says the Mishnah, the name of Beis Hillel, she'efer kira muchan. What that means is that we're going to somehow solve the problem of chafira, and we're going to allow chafira. And the question is why? Apparently, Beis Hillel agreed to Beit Shammai that if need be, and the only way he could check the animal is if he does the chafir for the sake of kisei adam, then we'll have to allow it. And now, in addition, we have a second problem that, okay, you've got the shechita, you've got the chafira, now you can do kisei adam. What happens in another case where you have no possibility of chafira? Let's say there's no offer available. What you have is afer. Afer means ashes. So let's say you have a campfire and there are ashes left in the campfire. Those are muktzah. Comes along Beis Hillel, it says that's fine for kisui. Why? The afer kira muchanu. What that means is that when a person keeps his fire going, he's got logs of wood in his campfire, and on Yontif, you're allowed to, feed the fire with logs of wood. He has in mind that if he needs the afer, he will use the afer. And there are different functions of afer. One of them is for kisei adam, and therefore there's no violation of muktzah. The question we want to raise here which seems like an obvious problem, is if Beis Hillel permitted you to do the chafira on Yontif, doesn't it go without saying that even if I would grant you that Ephah was not Muchal, but that the Ephah was Muktzah, that certainly would be Matir Muktzah. If we're being Matir Chafira for the sake of Kisi Adam, then certainly with the Kal V'chomer, we should be Matir Tiltul Muktzah. So that's a question that we'll have to address as we go through the Surah. In any event, just to summarize, there's a three-way machlokas presented in our Mishnah. One is about Beitza Shenolda B'Yontif. The other is about the shear, the minimum shear for Rabbi Motzei in the case of Chametz. And the third machlokas is about whether or not we allow lechatchila Kisi Adam, meaning we're going to permit you to do the Shechita and then the Kisi Adam. And Beis Hillel are machmir in all these three cases. Gemara asks, what is the case of Beitza Shenolda? And let's say by introduction, there are two categories of hens, of Tarnagolas. One hen is designated to lay eggs. That's what he uses it for. He produces eggs. The other hen is designated for Shechita. He's going to eat its flesh. What's the case in our Mishnah? It's a case of the Tarnagolas Omedes Lachila, the hen that laid this egg was designated for Achila. Now, as we said before, you're allowed to shecht an animal, in this case a bird, on Yontif for the sake of Ochel Nefesh. If that be the case, then he definitely had designated this Tarnagolas for Shechita. And therefore, there's no mukta. And the assumption is, if the Tarnagolas is not mukta, because you designated for Achila, then the Beitza itself is just simply part of the Tarnagolas. But that would explain only the Shita of Beit Shammai. But my Tamayid Beis Hillel. Why would Beis Hillel say that you're not allowed to eat the egg? Uchla di ifrasu. Now, ifras means nifrad. It was separated. Uchla di ifras. This is ochel that was separated from ochel, meaning the hen itself is ochel because it's been designated before Yantif for Shechita for Achila. And the egg is also a part of the hen. You're just simply separating one part from the other. It's like cutting off the limb of the animal after Shechita. For sure, that's not a problem. So why would Beis Hillel be machmir in the case of a Tarnagolas Homeres Lachila? And if you look quickly at Tosfos, the third Tosfos, he says, Ochel hanifrad min ha'ochel. The Beitza Shenolda nifrida hi min ha'tarnagolas. So therefore, the Tarnagolas itself is ochel, and now the Beitza is just a separated part from the ochel. That could not be mukt. Ella, therefore, by process of elimination, the Tarnagolas omedes legal Beitza. He did not designate it for achila. This is a chicken laying hen, and that's what it does, and that's what I use it for. Then says the Gemara, my Tamayid Beit Shammai mukti. Does Beit Shammai deny the concept of mukta? He did not in any way designate this egg. The egg was laid on Yontif, and if it's lacking any sort of preparation and any sort of designation, then it's mukta. And the Gemara now doesn't even understand the kasha. My kasha, Dilma Beit Shammai, let's say mukta. Why are you asking me this question? Your premise is that Beit Shammai certainly embraced the halacha of mukta, but in fact, we have a sheet of Rabbi Shimon, appears all over the place in Shabbos and elsewhere, that he doesn't hold the mukta. So, for example, if you put oil into a receptacle and you you put a wick into the oil and you light it on Erev Shabbos, when the light goes out, you can take that oil and it's not mukta. That's the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. Because in Rabbi Shimon's mind, since you might want to use the oil, then you didn't exclude it from use. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he holds, no, there's mukta. You designate it as a candle, and it's going to be burning on Shabbos, therefore it's not muchan, it's not in any way prepared for Shabbos. Maybe Beit Shammai accept the shita of Rabbi Shimon, Lesle Muktzah. So the Gemara now is going to work hard to explain the kash, why the Gemara thinks that if it's a Tarnagoles, Homedes Legal Beitzim, then certainly Beit Shammai would agree that it's Muktzah. And the Gemara says, Chasalka Daitin, Shafilu Leman Tishori B'Muktzah, even if I assume that Beit Shammai accepts the shita of Rabbi Shimon, nevertheless, but Nolad Asar. What is Nolad? You see, Muktzah means something that's in the world, but I didn't prepare it. I didn't expect to use it. Like, for example, I didn't know that the nair would be extinguished on Shabbos, and therefore I'd want to use the oil. So that's a machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is machmir, Rabbi Shimon is making. But the Gemara now insists that that's because the oil is in the world. It exists in the world. But the egg, in its present state after labor, after it's born, is nolad. It's not even in the world. And therefore, everybody, even Rabbi Shimon, would agree that it's muktzah. You cannot possibly prepare an egg that's not in the world. It's interesting that Tosfos here has a discussion about rainwater. He wants to know if rainwater should be nola because it's in the clouds and it rains on Shabbos. So my Tamai de Beit Shammai. Omer Rav Nachman li olam v'targolos homeres legal Beitza. Ude islay muktzah islay nolad ude leslay muktzah leslay nolad. Beit Shammai k'Rab Shimon ubeis Hill k'Rab Yehuda. So Rav Nachman says, forget about your kash. You're asking under the premise that even Rav Shimon, who rejects and is lenient in muktzah, would still concede that nolad is also. So I disagree with you. Nolad is simply a subcategory of muktzah. In other words, if you hold from muktzah, then you hold from nolad. In both cases, what you're lacking is hachana. You didn't prepare it. You didn't expect it. Rabbi Shimon says, I don't care if he expected it or not. He didn't indicate that he's not interested in it. There was no negative way. You know, the Rabbi Shimon, the Gemara says, would be modeh that if you took something and you locked it up before Shabbos, that would be muktzah. That's called hiktzah midaitum. He excludes, but he didn't exclude the shevenship in there. And he has in the back of his mind the possibility that maybe the light will be extinguished and he'll use the nair. He has a tarnagolos homedes legal beitzim, and he has in mind the possibility that maybe the chicken, maybe the hen would lay the egg today. So therefore, Rav Nachman argues that if you reject muktzah as an isur, then you reject nolad. Man de machshir, man de matir, b'muktzah yatir b'nolad. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, who prohibits muktzah, in the case of the shevenship in there, he would certainly prohibit nolad. But Beit Shammai accepting based the shita of Rabbi Shimon, the leslay muktzah, leslay nolad. If there's no muktzah, there's no nolad. Umi Omer Rav Nachman Hachi. Vatnan, we have a Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos on Daf Kuf Mem Gimel. And once again, the way it's presented by the Mishnah, Beit Shammai on Mekil and Beis Hillel on Machmir. And it's all about mukt. What's the case? The case is atzamos uklipin. You have bones and skin or kernel or the outside covering of something, and it's soulless. It's not something that you want to eat. And it ends up on the table. You imagine you're eating a piece of chicken and it's got a bone, and you finish your meal, there's a bone on the table. So Beit Shammai says, I don't have any problem, says Beit Shammai, in taking something and removing it from the table just because it's atzamos uklipin. It's not edible. Again, in my family, we eat the bones, but most people don't eat bones. We eat the bones. That's a legacy from the war, from our parents, because we didn't throw out bones. I mean, you can always get something out of the bone. I wouldn't chew the bone, but get the marrow out of the bone. But be it as may, we're talking about something that's not edible, and he wants to take it out. If it's refuse, he wants to throw it in the rubbish. And Beit Shammai have no problem with that. Beis Hillel Omer, no. You're going to have to move the atzomos and the klipin indirectly. Because to move it directly, pick it up and throw it in the rubbish can, that would be a violation of muktzah. And therefore, misalik es hatavna, in our terms, in contemporary language, would say just remove the tablecloth, hula, umenara. Once you have the tablecloth, today we use these plastic disposable tablecloths. So wrap up the tablecloth and then throw it all out. But a direct picking up of the atzamas and the klipin, according to Beitza, is prohibited. And Rav Nachman was very perturbed by this Mishnah, the way the Mishnah formulates, because it comes out at Beit Shammai are the Mekilim and Beis Hillel are the Machmirim. And that goes against the grain because we have a rule that, barring very rare exceptions, Beit Shammai is always the Machmir, Beis Hillel is always the Mekil. Therefore, Amar Rav Nachman, Anu Ein Lanu, our gears in the Mishnah, as we receive the transmission, Ela Beit Shammai ki Rabbi Yehuda, uBeis Hillel ki Rabbi Shimon. What we're going to do is we're going to make Beit Shammai into the Machmirim. They're going to accept the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that there's an Isur Muktzah. And just like there's Muktzah according to Rabbi Yehuda in the case of the Chemin Chibaner, so too by analogy there's Muktzah in the Atzamos Utim. And it's Beis Hillel who are Mekil. They hold like Rabbi Shimon, the Lesle Muktzah. And just like Rabbi Shimon is matir, moving the oil from the Ner, so too he's matir, moving the klipos and the atzamos. So we see that Rav Nachman switched around the shitos. And now we have a problem because we just finished saying that according to Rav Nachman, the machlokas in our Mishnah between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel regarding a Beitza Shenolda is about nolad as an extension of muktzah. Nolad equals muktzah. It's just another form, an expression of muktzah. And Beit Shammai on the Mekilim, they allow the Beitza to be eaten, despite the fact that it's nolad, because they all like Rav Shimon, the Lesle muktzah. Mind the Lesle muktzah, according to Rav Nachman, Lesle nolad. And Dafka, Beis Hillel were the Machmir. Amalacha Rav Nachman, you made a big mistake. Your analogy is from Yontif to Shabbos. Our Mishnah is talking about Yontif. And the Mishnah that you're quoting, where I myself, says Rav Nachman, changed around the shitos, and I had Beis Hillel as the Mekilim, that's addressing Shabbos. Now, Rabbos, watch the paradox here. It comes out that Rav Nachman, in the sheet of Beis Hillel, in our Mishnah of Yontif, are the Machmirim. But according to Rav Nachman, in the Mishnah Shabbos, Beis Hillel are the Mekilim. They allow you to move the klipos on Shabbos. Isn't that paradoxical? Amal Rav Nachman, Ligavi Shabbos, Nisasam Lantana Rabbi Shimon. We have a Mishnah. That's a Stav Mishnah. It's an anonymous Mishnah without a name. And we always pass it like an anonymous Mishnah. And it reflects the Shita of Shimon, the Lesle Muktzah. And the Mishnah reads, okay, that's not relevant to us. Means that for the sake of the animal, you're allowed to do a great tircha of cutting up these gourds, and we're not going to prohibit it that. It's not tircha yisera, which is also on Shabbos. But now we get to our issue. If an animal dies on Shabbos, it drops dead, you can take its carcass and feed it to your dog. And that implies that there's no Isur Muktzah because you're lifting up the carcass, cutting it up, and feeding it to your dog. And that's a Stam Mishnah that permits Muktzah. No mention of any name. So I'm forced, says Rav Nachman, Mukim La Lebeis Hillel. we always pass like Beis Hillel. We pass like a Stam Mishnah. We must therefore assume that Beis Hillel make it in Muktzah, but only on Shabbos, because the Mishnah is on Shabbos. And in the case of Klipos, the way Rav Nachman presents that Mishnah, it's Beis Hillel who are matir tiltul of Klipos Vatzamos because they don't have Muktzah on Shabbos. Is Mukim Lo Beis Hillel, Rabbi Shimon. We're going to assume that Beis Hillel accept the kula, the shita of Rabbi Shimon with regard to Shabbos, and that's why the Stam Mishnah of Rebbe meaning Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he left out a name to indicate that we pass him like this Mishnah, and mechatchinis hanevela lifnei aklavim, even though nevela would be a classical case of mukt.